Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Before we begin tonight's case, take a moment to settle in. Find a quiet place, get comfortable, and let the noise of the day slowly fade away. Whether you're lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or sitting in the soft glow of a dimly lit room, this is your time to unwind. Close your eyes if you'd like, slow your breathing, and let the sound of the rain carry you deeper into the story. Tonight, we travel back to Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s, a city alive with steel mills, smoke, and restless streets. But beneath its busy surface lay shadows darker than anyone imagined. In the working-class neighborhood of Kingsbury Run, a series of gruesome discoveries would leave the city frozen in fear. It began with one body, and then another, and soon, the whispers turned into terror. This is the story of a killer who came to be known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, a phantom who left behind 13 victims, countless questions, and a mystery that has remained unsolved for nearly a century. In the summer of 1935, Cleveland was a city caught between shadows. The Great Depression had stripped its streets bare, leaving thousands without work and forcing many into shantytowns scattered along the edges of the city. One of the most desolate areas was Kingsbury Run, a stretch of ravines, freight yards, and muddy poughs where the homeless built makeshift shelters from scrap wood and canvas. At night, the smoke of steel mills clung low in the air, mixing with the damp scent of Lake Erie, while shadows stretched long across the narrow streets. Life was difficult, but people endured, holding on to whatever small comforts they could find. Then, on a humid September morning, two boys wandering near the edges of Kingsbury Run stumbled upon something that would shatter Cleveland as fragile calm. Among the overgrown weeds lay the remains of a man's torso, headless, armless, and stripped of clothing. The discovery sent a chill through the community, not only for its brutality but for what it suggested. This was no accident. Whoever had done this had planned it, carried it out with precision, and left the body in a place where someone would eventually find it. Police descended on the area, carefully combing the ravines for evidence, but there was little to be found. The victim had been decapitated cleanly, and the killer had removed fingerprints, making identification almost impossible. For a city already weighed down by poverty and fear, the gruesome discovery cast a deeper shadow over Kingsbury Run. At first, detectives believed it might be a personal dispute, some isolated act of violence. But Cleveland would soon learn it was the beginning of something far more terrifying. Just 3 months later, in January 1936, another body was discovered not far from where the first torso had been found. This time, the victim was a woman. Her head, too, had been removed, and the cuts were so precise that investigators began whispering about surgical skill. The city could no longer ignore the pattern forming beneath the surface. Someone was hunting people, dismembering them, and discarding their remains in the heart of Cleveland. The newspapers quickly seized on the story, fueling rumors of a killer hiding among the city's working poor, a shadow slipping silently through the narrow alleys of Kingsbury Run. The discovery of 2 victims was enough to ignite panic among the residents, but police struggled to make progress. Witnesses offered conflicting statements, and the shantytowns surrounding the area were filled with transients, men who drifted from city to city, their names forgotten as quickly as they were learned. Detectives began to realize that this was no ordinary killer. Whoever he was organized, intelligent, and methodical. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was choosing his victims carefully and leaving as few traces as possible. The newspapers began calling him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, a name that captured the city's fear and frustration. Posters warned residents to avoid the area after dark, and whispers spread through the neighborhoods about strange figures seen near the ravines at night. Even in bars and diners miles away from the killings, People lowered their voices when they spoke of the butcher, their words carrying unease. Despite the growing panic, life in Kingsbury Run continued. Men still gathered around the freight yards hoping for day work. Families still huddled around fires in makeshift shelters. And children still played in the narrow, dirt-packed streets. But the sense of safety was gone. Every sound in the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a train whistle, the crunch of footsteps on wet ground, carried new meaning. People began locking their doors, boarding up windows, and leaving the area altogether, abandoning small belongings to escape the creeping dread. By mid-1936, as winter gave way to spring, the police formed a special task force to investigate the killings. Detectives spent long nights poring over missing persons reports, trying to match names to the remains recovered, but there were few matches to be made. Many of the victims appeared to be transient, men and women without steady work, without family nearby, without anyone to notice when they went missing. The killer's choice of victims, whether intentional or not, made his crimes harder to track and easier to hide. Then, in June of that year, a third body was discovered, this one found near a bridge overlooking Kingsbury Run. Like the others, the victim had been decapitated and stripped of clothing. But this time, the body showed signs of prolonged mutilation. Deep cuts across the torso that served no apparent purpose. Investigators were baffled by the brutality, and the city's panic deepened. With 3 victims in less than a year, the police could no longer keep the public calm. Patrols were increased around Kingsbury Run, and detectives began questioning hundreds of residents and workers in the surrounding areas. Yet the killer remained invisible, his presence felt only in the silence he left behind. By the time the summer heat returned, Cleveland had begun to change. Bars that once stayed open until dawn closed early. Families avoided the parks and ravines, and the shantytowns grew quieter as fear settled into every corner of the city. But the butcher wasn't finished. He was just getting started. By the spring of 1936, Cleveland was no longer a city simply haunted by whispers. It had become a place where fear lived openly in the streets, curling into alleyways, pressing into the quiet corners of homes and settling over the shantytowns of Kingsbury Run like a heavy fog. The discovery of the third victim had left the community on edge, but what came next would turn unease into terror. In September of that year, a man walking along the base of Jackass Hill, a steep slope near Kingsbury Run, noticed something half buried in the sand. At first, he thought it was animal remains, but as he approached, the horrifying reality came into view. There, lying partially concealed beneath the brush, was a torso severed cleanly from its head and limbs. The cuts were precise, deliberate, and eerily similar to those from the previous murders. Investigators knew immediately that the butcher had struck again. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone was killing with methodical precision, selecting victims seemingly at random, and disposing of their remains in places where they would eventually be found. It wasn't just murder, it was a performance, a message left for anyone willing to look closely enough. The newspapers seized the story once more, plastering headlines across the city about a killer who collects heads and hunts among the homeless. Panic spread quickly, especially among the city's most vulnerable, the men and women living without shelter along Kingsbury Run, whose lives already balanced precariously on the edge of survival. The police response intensified. Detectives canvassed the entire area, questioning hundreds of residents, drifters, and railroad workers. Patrols were increased along the freight yards, and plainclothes officers began shadowing those who seemed suspicious. But the chaos of Kingsbury Run worked against them. The area was transient by nature, with men moving in and out constantly, names lost as quickly as they were learned. Without fixed addresses, reliable witnesses, or clear connections between victims. Investigators were chasing ghosts in a labyrinth of shadows. Then, in January 1937, the city faced its most gruesome discovery yet. A man scavenging through a garbage pile near downtown found two burlap sacks. Inside were pieces of a human body, carefully wrapped and tied, as though prepared for transport. The head was missing, as it always was. The victim, later identified as a middle-aged man, had been decapitated with surgical precision, suggesting once again that the killer possessed skill, or at least an understanding, of anatomy. For detectives, this wasn't just brutality anymore, it was expertise. By this point, the whispers of the mad butcher had become a roar. Neighborhood meetings filled with worried families turned into shouting matches, with residents demanding answers the police couldn't give. The mayor's office faced growing pressure, and the city's leadership began searching for someone who could restore order and deliver results. That's when the case began drawing the attention of a man whose name carried weight across the country, Immerse, the famed prohibition agent who had helped bring down Al Capone. Before Immerse stepped in, however, the body count continued to rise. In June 1937, two more victims were discovered along the banks of the Cuyahoga River, their remains mutilated beyond recognition. Panic deepened, not just because of the killings themselves, but because the pattern was becoming impossible to predict. The first victims had been homeless men, transient laborers drifting through Kingsbury Run. But these new discoveries hinted at something far more terrifying. The killer was expanding his hunting grounds, choosing targets more deliberately, and possibly watching the investigation unfold as he worked. Cleveland lived in fear. Bars emptied earlier, streets fell quiet after sunset, and families locked their doors against an invisible predator who seemed always one step ahead of the law. Yet despite increased patrols, mass questioning, and a growing task force, the butcher slipped away time and again, leaving nothing behind but fragments of bodies and more questions than anyone could answer. In the following months, detectives began working closely with medical examiners to develop a psychological profile of their phantom killer. Based on the precision of the cuts and the lack of hesitation in the dismemberments, experts suggested someone calm, methodical, and possibly familiar with surgery or butchery. They envisioned a man who blended easily into his surroundings, who could walk unnoticed through crowded streets and quiet alleys alike, a predator hiding in plain sight. But profiles didn't stop the killings. By the end of 1937, the butcher's known victim count had climbed to at least 7, though investigators quietly suspected there were more. The unclaimed missing persons reports piling up at the police station painted a grim picture of how many people vanished unnoticed in Cleveland's poorest neighborhoods. The growing list of victims and the frustration of law enforcement only fueled the city's fear. Rumors spread wildly. Some claimed the butcher was a surgeon living among them. Others believed he was a transient drifting from city to city, leaving pieces of his crimes scattered across the Midwest. There were even whispers of multiple killers working together, though evidence for this theory was scarce. By early 1938, the pressure on the police department had reached its breaking point. The murders had gained national attention, and headlines across the country painted Cleveland as a city under siege. Families of victims demanded answers. The homeless camps near Kingsbury Run grew restless, and City Hall knew something had to change. It was here, amid this growing storm, that Immerse officially entered the case, determined to hunt the butcher down and end the reign of terror. But even as the legendary investigator took charge, the shadows of Kingsbury Run only grew darker. The butcher was still out there, still watching, still choosing, and no one knew where he would strike next. By the spring of 1938, Cleveland was drowning under the weight of fear. Kingsbury Run, once just another forgotten stretch of muddy ravines and freight yards, had become synonymous with death, Each discovery brought more panic, more whispers, and more unanswered questions. And yet, the killer moved like a shadow, silent, invisible, always one step ahead. When Elliot Ness officially joined the investigation, expectations soared. Ness was a national figure, a man whose fame was built on his success as a prohibition agent, helping to dismantle Al Capone's empire in Chicago. He was sharp, calculated, and relentless, known for his ability to take on organized crime and win. But Cleveland was different. This wasn't a case of mob bosses and bootleggers. Here, Ness faced something darker, an unknown killer who seemed to thrive in chaos and anonymity. Ness immediately reorganized the investigation, assigning a dedicated team of detectives to focus exclusively on the murders. His presence brought hope, but also tension. Many officers resented his reputation, believing it was undeserved and inflated by the press. But Ness pressed on, determined to control the narrative and deliver results to a terrified city. He increased patrols across Kingsbury Run, pushed for tighter surveillance, and quietly began to build a psychological profile of the man the press had dubbed the Mad Butcher. The community, however, remained restless. Families near the shantytowns demanded answers, while many of the city's poorest residents, those living closest to the danger, avoided the police altogether. Among the transient population, fear was compounded by distrust. Rumors swirled that the butcher wasn't just someone hiding among them, but possibly someone with authority, someone who could move freely without suspicion. The silence of potential witnesses kept investigators trapped in circles, chasing rumors more often than leads. By midsummer, Ness grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. Reports of missing persons continued to pile up, and the city's newspapers published sensational headlines that painted Cleveland as a city under siege. Politicians were calling for decisive action. Ness decided to make a bold, controversial move, one that would define his role in the case for decades to come. In August 1938, Ness ordered an unannounced midnight raid on the shantytowns surrounding Kingsbury Run. Hundreds of officers swept through the makeshift shelters, pulling sleeping residents from their cots, interrogating them, and setting fire to entire camps. The smoke from the burning shacks rose high above the ravines, visible for miles, carrying with it the belongings of men and women who had nowhere else to go. Ness believed destroying the shantytowns would flush the killer out, that by stripping away his hiding places, he could force him into the open. But the plan backfired. The raid sparked outrage among Cleveland's poorest residents and civil rights groups, who accused Ness of punishing the innocent while failing to protect them. The newspapers turned against him, shifting the story from the butcher to the brutality of Ness's tactics. And yet, despite the backlash, Ness doubled down, convinced that breaking the cycle of fear required force. In the weeks that followed, his gamble seemed to achieve little. Another body was discovered near the Cuyahoga River, the remains left just as deliberately as before. Ness was stunned. The killer hadn't been flushed out at all. If anything, the butcher seemed emboldened. His ability to strike so soon after such an aggressive police response suggesting he moved easily through the chaos, invisible even under the brightest spotlight. Privately, detectives began to question whether the killer was mocking them, placing the bodies deliberately where they would be found, demonstrating control over a city gripped by panic. Some theorized he had medical training, given the surgical precision of the dissections. Others believe he was a butcher or a hunter, someone accustomed to carving flesh with speed and confidence. There were even those who wondered if the butcher was directly connected to the investigation itself, slipping between the roles of predator and witness while feeding on the terror he created. By the end of 1938, the victim count had risen again, but the city's faith in law enforcement had crumbled. People stopped expecting answers. Families avoided the freight yards entirely, and Kingsbury Run, once alive with the sounds of trains, workers, and makeshift communities, grew eerily quiet. Where there had been conversation, now there was only silence, broken only by the distant sound of whistles and the occasional cries of children playing too close to the shadows. For Ness, the failure was personal. He had entered the case with the weight of his national reputation, believing his strategies, his resolve, and his history of success would be enough to stop the butcher. Instead, he found himself haunted by his inability to outthink a killer who left no trace but horror in his wake. The case files grew thicker with photographs, reports, and autopsy details, but inside those boxes were more questions than answers. And still, the butcher was out there, moving unseen through the fog that rolled in from Lake Erie, hunting where the city met the shadows. The murders would not stop here. Kingsbury Run would soon witness another wave of terror, bodies left in places chosen with purpose, and patterns no one could fully understand. By early 1939, the city of Cleveland had been living in a shadow for nearly 4 years. The name Kingsbury Run had become synonymous with terror, and the figure haunting it, the Mad Butcher, was now more myth than man. People whispered about him in bars, behind closed doors, in quiet corners where the hum of the city seemed distant. Each discovery deepened the fear, and yet the killer remained untouchable, a phantom who left bodies in his wake, but never a trace of himself. Despite his controversial tactics, Elliot Ness refused to retreat. After the raid that burned the shantytowns to the ground, Ness doubled the number of plainclothes officers patrolling the area. He spent long nights in his office, leaning over maps, photographs, and autopsy reports, searching for any thread that might tie the killings together. But there were no threads, only fragments. Each victim seemed different from the last, each murder site chosen with deliberate randomness, as though the killer anticipated every move the police would make. In March, another discovery shocked the city. A pair of boys playing along the river stumbled upon a burlap sack wedged beneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Inside were the remains of a man dismembered with the same practiced precision as before. Detectives swarmed the site, carefully sifting through the mud and debris for anything the killer might have left behind. But again, there was nothing. No footprints, no fibers, no fingerprints, just silence. The press descended on the story, once more igniting panic. Headlines screamed about Cleveland's failure to catch its killer, painting Ness as ineffective despite his fame and authority. For the first time, whispers began to circulate that perhaps Ness himself was losing control of the city, of his department, and of the fragile confidence of its people. But Ness wasn't the only one under pressure. Detectives within the Special Task Force were now working without rest, chasing leads that led nowhere, questioning suspects who vanished as quickly as they appeared. The constant failures created tension inside the department, and morale began to break. Arguments flared between officers over theories and suspects, each convinced they were right, while the butcher moved unseen through their chaos. One theory, whispered among investigators, suggested the killer might be someone with deep knowledge of anatomy, perhaps a medical student, a surgeon, or even someone connected to the local slaughterhouses. The clean cuts, the precision, the speed required to dismember victims so completely, it all suggested skill rather than savagery. Yet when detectives visited hospitals, universities, and meat-packing facilities, they came up empty. There were no missing tools, no suspicious employees, nothing to connect anyone directly to the murders. Then came one of the case's most chilling moments. In August 1939, 2 more torsos were discovered floating in the Cuyahoga River. Their remains were badly decomposed, but what disturbed investigators wasn't just the condition of the bodies, it was where they'd been left. The river ran directly beneath the city's busiest streets, meaning the killer had carried these bodies through the heart of Cleveland before dumping them where they would eventually resurface. It wasn't carelessness. It was a message. Despite the horror, Nis remained quiet in public, rarely addressing the press. Behind the scenes, however, his frustration boiled over. He began focusing on a handful of key suspects, men who had been questioned before but never charged. One of them was a doctor, intelligent, charming, and living not far from Kingsbury Run. Witnesses placed him near multiple murder sites, and several survivors described a man matching his appearance. But there wasn't enough to hold him, and releasing him only fueled rumors across the city. Some whispered that Nis was protecting him. Others, that the doctor had powerful connections keeping him safe. As weeks turned into months, fear began to evolve into resignation. People avoided the freight yards, abandoned their homes near the ravines, and stopped reporting missing relatives. For many living closest to Kingsbury Run, survival meant silence. The killer seemed untouchable, and trusting the police offered no safety. By the end of 1939, the confirmed victim count had climbed into double digits, and yet the investigation remained stalled. Nis's political allies grew distant, and the once praised untouchable now faced mounting criticism from nearly every side. To the city, the task force had failed. To Nis, the failure was personal. And yet, in the quiet of his office late at night, surrounded by maps dotted with pins and photographs lying neatly in rows, Nis refused to let the butcher's shadow fade. He was convinced the killer had grown bold, perhaps even arrogant, moving freely through Cleveland while everyone else searched for a phantom. To Nis, the message was clear. The butcher wasn't hiding anymore, he was watching. But if Nis thought the killings would stop, he was wrong. The city had not yet seen the worst of Kingsbury Run. The butcher's reign was far from over. And the next discoveries would plunge Cleveland into fear deeper than ever before. By the winter of 1940, Cleveland had reached its breaking point. The body count continued to climb, and yet the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run remained untouchable, a phantom leaving his message in pieces of bodies scattered through the ravines, riverbanks, and quiet corners of the city. Fear had hardened into something heavier now, not just panic, but resignation. Families stopped expecting answers. People who once searched for missing friends and relatives no longer went to the police. It was as though the city had accepted the darkness, adapting to it like one might adapt to a long, brutal winter. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was suffocating. The Special Task Force, once seen as Cleveland's last hope, was fractured and exhausted. Detectives moved like shadows through endless files and photographs, but every clue they uncovered dissolved into uncertainty. Tensions between officers rose as theories collided. Some believed the butcher was a transient, someone hiding in the abandoned tunnels and shanty towns of Kingsbury Run. Others were convinced he was a man of privilege, someone who walked openly among them, invisible because he looked so ordinary. Every lead felt fragile. Every suspect faded into silence. In February, a discovery shook the city yet again. A factory worker crossing a snow-covered bridge noticed something frozen into the icy edge of the Cuyahoga River. When detectives arrived, they uncovered a torso encased in ice, its limbs cleanly removed, the head missing as always. Forensic examiners determined that the body had been placed there deliberately, positioned in such a way that the rising winter sun would eventually reveal it to anyone walking by. This wasn't random disposal, it was staging. The butcher wasn't hiding his crimes anymore, he was taunting the city. The newspapers devoured the story, calling the killer bold, arrogant, and unstoppable. Panic spread quickly, and once again Nis found himself at the center of public scrutiny. Nis had been brought in to restore order, to do the impossible, to catch a ghost who carved through the city without leaving a trace. But now, almost 2 years into his involvement, The butcher was still free, and Ness's reputation, once larger than life, had begun to crumble. Privately, Ness's frustration turned into obsession. He pored over maps of Cleveland late into the night, marking the locations of each body, looking for patterns the others might have missed. He personally interrogated dozens of suspects, visiting boarding houses and meat-packing plants, questioning hospital interns and fishermen, moving methodically through every name on his list. One suspect, a wealthy doctor living not far from Kingsbury Run, drew particular attention. He was eccentric, intelligent, and known for erratic behavior that made him a subject of quiet gossip. Several witnesses placed him near key crime scenes. But Ness lacked the one thing he needed most: proof. Without physical evidence, without a confession, there was nothing the courts could hold on to. Meanwhile, the city's poorer residents suffered under the weight of Ness's policies. His decision to burn the shantytowns months earlier had displaced hundreds of people, many of whom were already living on the edge of survival. With nowhere left to go, they drifted into alleys and abandoned buildings, avoiding both the shadows and the officers sent to protect them. Distrust deepened on both sides, making cooperation nearly impossible. Among the transient population, the very group the butcher hunted most frequently, silence became survival. No one asked questions. No one answered them. By late spring, another body was found, this time in an empty lot on the city's east side. The victim had been killed recently, the mutilations as deliberate and controlled as ever. Investigators noted something new: faint traces of chemical residue on the skin, likely used to slow decomposition. To detectives, it was further proof of the butcher's planning and precision. This wasn't madness, this was mastery. The deeper the police dug, the more haunting the details became. Several of the butcher's victims had been decapitated so cleanly that forensic examiners speculated he had practiced repeatedly, refining his method until it was almost mechanical. The precision was unnerving, but so was the variety of his chosen victims. Some were homeless men from Kingsbury Run, others were factory workers, and still others came from more stable, working-class neighborhoods. There was no consistent age, no predictable type, no clear motive that detectives could cling to. It was randomness weaponized, the kind of unpredictability that made catching him nearly impossible. By the summer of 1940, Ness had narrowed his focus to a handful of suspects, but each investigation ended the same way: dead ends and silence. Evidence degraded quickly in Cleveland's humid summers, and the transient nature of the victims meant there were few connections to trace. The butcher thrived in these gaps, exploiting the chaos of a city struggling to hold itself together during the final, grinding years of the Great Depression. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. After the discovery of the last known victim, the city waited days, weeks, months, expecting the horror to continue. But Kingsbury Run remained quiet. No new bodies surfaced. No fresh headlines screamed through the papers. For the first time in years, Cleveland exhaled, but uneasily. The absence of violence didn't feel like safety, it felt like something suspended, a breath held too long. Inside the police department, no one believed the butcher was truly gone. Some theorized that he had moved on, carrying his darkness into another city where his name meant nothing. Others suspected he had been imprisoned for an unrelated crime, locked away while his identity remained a secret. And there were those who believed the scariest possibility of all, that he had simply stopped, blending into the background, living an ordinary life. Perhaps even walking past the officers who had hunted him for years. Elliot Ness never stopped believing he knew who the butcher was. Privately, he confided in colleagues that he was certain about the doctor suspect, the charming, wealthy man whose name the papers never printed. But Ness couldn't prove it, and without proof, the case remained unsolved. As the years passed, Ness's own career faded, his once great reputation dulled by controversy and failure. Yet in his private writings, discovered long after his death, he still carried the weight of Kingsbury Run with him. He believed they had been close, terrifyingly close, to catching him. But the silence of that final step left the mystery hanging like a shadow over his legacy. Even today, nearly a century later, the Cleveland torso murders remain open. 13 official victims, possibly more. Dozens of suspects, none convicted. A city haunted by a phantom who vanished without leaving his name behind. And somewhere, buried deep in forgotten evidence boxes, there may still be a clue, a fragment of DNA, a misplaced photograph, a long-overlooked statement that could finally give the Mad Butcher a face. For now, though, the silence remains. And in the cold, damp ravines of Kingsbury Run, where the smoke from the old mill still drifts on windy nights, you can almost feel it, the weight of those years, the unanswered questions, and the chilling reminder that some shadows never truly disappear. By the early 1940s, Cleveland was exhausted. The killings that had haunted the city for nearly a decade had seemingly stopped, but the silence was uneasy, like a pause before a storm that never came. 13 known victims, countless missing persons, and an investigation that consumed years of effort, yet the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run had vanished without leaving behind a name. Inside the police department, detectives faced a cruel truth. The case was collapsing under the weight of its own unanswered questions. Every lead had been chased, every suspect interrogated, and every piece of evidence examined, but nothing tied together. Over the years, boxes of reports, photographs, and statements filled entire rooms, but no combination of those fragments ever revealed the whole picture. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the pool of suspects. The strongest among them was a respected local doctor whose name has been deliberately kept out of public records. He was intelligent, wealthy, and eccentric, with a history of instability that drew suspicion early on. Witnesses placed him near several crime scenes, and his access to surgical tools matched the precision seen in the dismemberments. Ness himself focused heavily on him, personally interrogating him multiple times. At one point, the doctor voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric hospital shortly after a particularly tense round of questioning, which only deepened suspicions. Yet, without direct evidence, Ness couldn't act. There were no fingerprints, no confessions, no undeniable link tying him to the murders. Other suspects came and went, each more frustrating than the last. One was a meatpacker, known to carry knives, and lived near the railroad yards where several bodies were found. Another was a fisherman who spent long nights along the Cuyahoga River, always near places where remains surfaced. A handful of transient laborers were questioned repeatedly, only to vanish entirely months later, swallowed up by the uncertainty of the times. Each suspect seemed plausible, and each ultimately dissolved into nothing. By 1941, the case had slowed to a crawl. Detectives still patrolled the ravines of Kingsbury Run, still scanned the banks of the river, but no new bodies appeared. Some believed the butcher had died, perhaps of illness or accident, taking his secrets to the grave. Others believed he had simply left Cleveland behind, moving into another city where his crimes could begin again unnoticed. But Ness and his closest investigators never accepted these theories fully. In their private discussions, they returned again and again to the same idea. The butcher was still alive, still close, and possibly still watching them. What haunted investigators most wasn't just the brutality of the murders, but their consistency. Each body was left in a way that seemed deliberate, displayed without panic, without rush. Every cut carried precision, every disposal appeared intentional. Forensics experts of the time insisted that the butcher wasn't acting blindly or impulsively. These weren't crimes of opportunity, they were acts of control. Even the placement of remains, scattered across different neighborhoods, sometimes far from Kingsbury Run, hinted at someone who understood the rhythms of the city, someone who blended effortlessly into its patterns. By the mid-1940s, public attention had shifted elsewhere. The war dominated headlines, and the memory of Kingsbury Run faded into the background. But for the families of the victims, the silence was unbearable. Mothers, siblings, and friends sent letters to the police station begging for updates that never came. Detectives responded when they could, but the truth was always the same. There was nothing new to report. Elliot Ness, once celebrated as a hero for taking down Al Capone, carried the weight of Kingsbury Run for the rest of his life. In his private papers, discovered years after his death, he expressed his deepest regret over the case. He believed they had come close, agonizingly close, to catching the butcher but missed the chance by a matter of inches. He admitted he had always suspected the doctor, though without the evidence to make an arrest. The truth remained locked away with him. Decades later, in the 1960s and 1970s, cold case investigators revisited the evidence. Advances in forensic science promised new possibilities, but the results were disappointing. Most samples had degraded beyond use, and many physical pieces from the original investigation had been misplaced, damaged, or destroyed over time. Witnesses had died, and memories had faded. The case, though technically open, had slipped into the realm of legend, studied more by historians than detectives. Today, nearly a century later, the Cleveland torso murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. 13 confirmed victims. Dozens of missing persons who may have been connected. A city terrorized into silence. And a killer who vanished as suddenly as he appeared. In the heart of Cleveland, Kingsbury Run has changed. The shantytowns are gone, the freight yards quieter now, but when the fog rolls in from Lake Erie and the wind carries the echoes of passing trains, the stories return. People still walk those paths and remember the phantom who walked there too, a man with a blade, a plan, and a silence so deep it swallowed an entire city's fear. The unanswered questions remain. Was the butcher a doctor with dark secrets, hidden beneath wealth and respectability? Was he a transient who left Cleveland behind, carrying his darkness into another forgotten town? Or was he someone no one ever suspected, someone whose ordinary face made him invisible even as he stood in the crowd, watching the chaos he created? The case of the Mad Butcher endures because it refuses to be solved. It sits suspended in time, frozen in incomplete evidence and fading memories, a story with no ending, where every path leads back into shadows. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all, that somewhere, the name of the man who terrified a city for nearly a decade exists, written down, known by someone, waiting to be spoken. But until it is, the butcher of Kingsbury Run remains what he always was, a phantom carved from fear, hidden in silence, and haunting Cleveland's history. By the mid-1940s, the Cleveland torso murders had already become one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history. With 13 confirmed victims, and perhaps several more lost in the silence of Kingsbury Run, investigators had exhausted every lead, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and pored over thousands of pages of reports. And yet, the name of the Mad Butcher remained hidden in the shadows. But while the investigation stalled, theories flourished, some grounded in evidence, others drifting into speculation, each more chilling than the last. One of the strongest theories revolved around a prominent Cleveland doctor whose identity remains sealed even today. He was intelligent, well-respected, and eccentric, the sort of man whose charm concealed unpredictable behaviors. Witnesses had placed him near several sites where bodies were discovered, and his access to surgical equipment matched the precision of the dismemberments. Ness himself believed this man was the butcher. In private notes, Nis allegedly confessed his certainty, but without fingerprints, confessions, or surviving witnesses willing to testify, his hands were tied. Some detectives claimed Nis pushed the doctor into a corner so forcefully during questioning that the man voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric hospital soon after. To Nis, that was as close as he would ever get to a confession, but to the courts, it was meaningless. Another theory suggested that the butcher wasn't a man of privilege at all, but a transient who used the chaos of Kingsbury Run to disappear among the city's homeless population. With hundreds of men moving in and out of the shantytowns daily, a killer could stalk, strike, and vanish without notice. Some believed he was a former slaughterhouse worker or hunter, someone whose skills came not from medical training but from years of butchery. The city's slaughterhouses were filled with men who handled knives expertly, and several were questioned intensely, but none were ever charged. There were darker rumors, too, whispers of police corruption and cover-ups. Some theorized that the butcher had ties to powerful figures in Cleveland, people who ensured his protection while the investigation chased dead ends. A few pointed to Nis's handling of the case itself, especially the controversial burning of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns, suggesting that the raid wasn't just about flushing out a killer, but about erasing witnesses and destroying potential leads. Nis denied these accusations, but the backlash haunted his career and legacy. And then there were theories stranger still. Some investigators speculated that there wasn't just one killer but two, perhaps working together, perhaps operating separately, but leaving similar signatures. The randomness of the victims, the variation in cutting techniques, and the differences in disposal sites seemed, to some, too inconsistent for a single mind. But no physical evidence ever supported this idea, and over time, it faded into the background of whispered speculation. By the 1960s, decades after the killings had stopped, cold case detectives returned to the evidence with fresh eyes. They re-examined every photograph, every report, every autopsy file, looking for connections the original investigators might have missed. Technology, however, hadn't advanced enough to solve a crime this old. Most biological samples had degraded beyond use, and crucial evidence had been lost to time. As the years passed, witnesses died, memories faded, and the case receded into the fog of Cleveland's haunted history. But in the 21st century, the story found new life. With advances in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, investigators began quietly reviewing stored evidence, hoping to extract even the smallest trace from preserved fragments of clothing and bone. While the results remain undisclosed, many experts believe the identity of the butcher may finally be within reach. One distant relative, one partial match, one overlooked detail could unlock a secret nearly 90 years old. Even today, theories persist. Some believe the butcher moved on and continued killing in other states, his crimes lost in police files that were never connected. Others believe he died before the killings ended, explaining the sudden halt in 1940. And then there are those who insist the truth has been known for decades, that Nis's top suspect, the elusive doctor, was indeed the butcher, protected by his privilege and erased from public record to shield the city from scandal. Kingsbury Run itself has changed. The freight yards are quiet now, the shantytowns gone, the muddy ravines filled in. But on damp nights, when the fog drifts low and the hum of passing trains echoes faintly through the air, the past feels close. Locals still whisper about the days when Cleveland walked in fear, when a shadow hunted its streets, and when the city's greatest secret slipped through its fingers. The case remains officially open, resting in the archives of the Cleveland Police Department. Boxes of files, yellowed with age, sit in storage, carrying fragments of a story no one has ever fully told. Inside them are photographs, brittle statements, and clues too small to solve the puzzle, but maybe just enough to complete it one day. Until then, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains what he has always been, a phantom carved from silence, his face hidden beneath decades of unanswered questions. A reminder that sometimes, even when the truth feels close enough to touch, it can still slip quietly into the shadows and vanish forever. By the early 1940s, Cleveland had learned to live with unanswered questions. The killings had stopped, but the shadow of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run stretched long over the city. The newspapers stopped screaming, the panic faded from the streets, and yet, beneath the calm, there was an unease no amount of time could erase. People avoided the ravines, the old freight yards, and the forgotten tunnels where bodies had once been found. It wasn't safety they felt now, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from too many years of fear with too few answers. Inside the Cleveland Police Department, the investigation quietly slipped into silence. Dust gathered on boxes of photographs, witness statements, and autopsy reports. Detectives, retired or transferred, taking their theories and regrets with them. Every once in a while, a younger officer would pull out the files, tracing pins on a faded map, hoping to see something the others had missed. But there was no breakthrough. There were only fragments, 13 confirmed victims, maybe more, and the name of a killer no one could speak because no one had ever found it. For Elliot Ness, the case became a ghost that never left. He had arrived with fame and confidence, a man celebrated for helping bring down Al Capone, but Cleveland humbled him. In private conversations, Ness confided in close colleagues that he believed they had come within inches of catching the butcher. His suspicions always circled back to the doctor, the wealthy eccentric who lived not far from Kingsbury Run, the man several witnesses quietly identified but no one dared accuse publicly. Ness interrogated him more than once, hoping for a slip, a confession, something to break the silence. It never came. The doctor lived out his life quietly, untouched, his name sealed away, and with him may have gone the truth Ness chased until his final days. By the time Ness died in 1957, the case was already legend. Kingsbury Run was quieter now, its shantytowns long gone, but the stories remained. Parents still warned their children about the ravines after dark, and old-timers whispered about the nights when Cleveland felt hunted. The Mad Butcher had become more myth than man, a phantom carved from unanswered questions and the echoes of trains rolling past the freight yards. Decades later, advances in forensic science brought brief hope. DNA testing promised new answers, and cold case detectives carefully reopened evidence boxes, searching through what little remained, preserved scraps of clothing, fragments of bone, faded photographs. But time had eroded the case more than the killer ever could. Samples degraded, records lost, memories blurred beyond use. Once again, Cleveland faced the silence. And yet, the city never forgot. Even today, when fog drifts low over the Cuyahoga River and train whistles echo softly through the night, locals swear there is still something heavy in the air near Kingsbury Run. A feeling that some secrets refuse to stay buried. The name of the butcher may never be spoken, but his shadow lingers in the collective memory of a city that once walked in fear. But while Cleveland wrestled with its phantom, farther south, another story was unfolding, one equally strange, chilling, and unforgettable. The year was 1918, and New Orleans pulsed with life. The city was a living symphony, the clatter of streetcars, the cries of vendors, and the wail of jazz spilling from open windows into humid night air. Crowded balconies leaned over narrow streets lit by flickering gas lamps, while laughter rose from crowded bars and dance halls. But beneath the rhythm, there was tension, a heaviness in the air that few noticed until it was too late. On a warm spring night, a killer stepped silently into the city's history. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a young couple living on Upper Line Street, were found in their home, brutally attacked as they slept. Their throats were cut with a straight razor, their skulls crushed by an axe that the killer left behind, cleaned carefully, placed deliberately. There was no forced entry, no theft, no motive the police could see. Only blood and silence. The newspapers called him the Axeman of New Orleans, and the city trembled. Doors were locked, windows nailed shut, families slept in shifts, watching the shadows beneath their doors. But just as fear gripped the streets, the killer vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving the city in uncertainty. For months, New Orleans waited, hoping it was over. It wasn't. Within a year, he would strike again, and soon, the story of the Axeman would become something more than a string of murders. It would become legend, a tale of music, fear, and a chilling letter that promised salvation through jazz. That's where we go next. In the spring of 1918, New Orleans was alive in a way few other cities could match. The humid Louisiana air carried the sound of music, the steady rhythm of streetcars, the distant laughter spilling out of open bars, and the wail of jazz echoing through the French Quarter's narrow cobblestone streets. Crowded balconies leaned over lamplit alleys, where voices blended with saxophones and the clinking of glasses. By day, the city was bustling. By night, it shimmered under flickering gas lamps, soaked in heat and sound. People danced in packed clubs, couples strolled along quiet streets, and neighbors gathered on porches to escape the heavy air. But beneath the rhythm of life, there was tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent no one could yet name. The first attack came without warning. On the night of May 23, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a young couple living on Upper Line Street, were preparing to close their small grocery store and settle in for the night. They had no reason to fear. Theirs was a quiet neighborhood where people left doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. But sometime after midnight, an intruder slipped inside their home, moving silently through the shadows. Armed with a straight razor and an axe, he descended upon the couple as they slept. Joseph's throat was cut so deeply that the blade nearly severed his head. Catherine's wounds were equally horrific, her skull crushed under repeated blows. When neighbors discovered them the next morning, the sight was unbearable. Blood pooled beneath the bed, the sheets soaked through, and yet there was no sign of robbery, no struggle, no reason anyone could understand. The police were baffled. The killer had used Joseph's own straight razor, taken from a small shelf near the bed, but he had also left behind his own weapon, a heavy axe carefully cleaned and placed against the wall. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, nothing that tied anyone to the crime. Forensics in 1918 offered little to work with, and the investigation stalled almost immediately. Theories swirled. Perhaps it was a business dispute, a jealous lover, or even a random act of violence, but none of them fit the precision and brutality of what happened that night. Before the shock faded, a second attack came. On June 27, 1918, just 5 weeks later, Louis and Harriet Bessemer were found inside their small apartment above a grocery store. Both had been struck in the head with an axe, Harriet fatally, Louis barely clinging to life. The similarities were undeniable: the weapon, the wounds, the lack of theft or motive. The newspapers seized on the connection immediately, and soon the whispers began. New Orleans had a killer, someone stalking couples in their beds, striking silently, and disappearing without a trace. As the summer deepened, so did the fear. Families began bolting their doors, nailing windows shut, and sleeping in shifts. Shops closed earlier, streets emptied faster, and the lively sounds of the French Quarter softened into an easy quiet. In coffeehouses and markets, people whispered theories. Some said the killer chose homes randomly, others believed he was watching his victims for days before striking. There were rumors of a deranged butcher, an escaped convict, even a man possessed by something darker than reason. Then, in August 1918, The Axeman struck again. This time, the victim was Anna Schneider, a young, heavily pregnant woman living on Elmira Street. Neighbors found her unconscious, her face and head battered by repeated blows from a blunt weapon. Miraculously, she survived, giving birth to a healthy baby days later. Once again, nothing was stolen, and once again, the weapon, an axe taken from the victim's own home, was left behind. With 3 attacks in just 3 months, panic gripped New Orleans. The city's police department, stretched thin by the demands of wartime, struggled to coordinate an investigation. Detectives from different precincts argued over theories, witnesses contradicted each other, and suspects came and went without charges. The press only fanned the flames, publishing headlines that screamed of a phantom killer haunting the city's nights. By the end of 1918, the fear had become palpable. Families no longer trusted their neighbors, and the streets emptied after sunset. People purchased locks, dogs, and weapons, desperate to protect themselves from a predator who seemed always to know exactly where to strike. The randomness of the attacks terrified them most. There was no pattern to the victims, young, old, married, single, rich, poor. The Axeman spared no one. Then, for a brief moment, the city breathed. The attacks stopped, and for months, New Orleans slept without terror. People began to hope the nightmare had ended. But as the warm, damp spring of 1919 returned, so did the killer. And this time, he would change the story forever, not just through his crimes, but through his words. Because one night, a letter arrived. Signed by the Axeman himself, it promised death, salvation, and something far stranger than anyone could have imagined. And it was about to turn New Orleans upside down. By early 1919, New Orleans had begun to recover from the previous year's terror. The winter months had passed without incident, and the city dared to believe that the nightmare of the Axeman was over. Doors were unlocked again, neighbors spoke freely in the streets, and the constant unease that had hung over the city began to fade. But then, on March 13, 1919, everything changed. That evening, the editors of the Times-Picayune received a letter written in an elegant but unsettling hand. It was addressed to the esteemed people of New Orleans and signed by someone claiming to be the Axeman himself. The letter was strange, theatrical, and deeply disturbing. In it, the writer declared that he was no mere man but a spirit and demon from the hottest hell, invisible and unstoppable. He mocked the police for their failure to catch him, calling them fools who would never know his identity. But the most chilling part came in his promise for the following Tuesday night. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared, in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The city went silent. For a moment, no one knew whether to believe the letter, but the words spread quickly, whispered in shops, printed in newspapers, passed from porch to porch. A wave of panic washed over New Orleans, unlike anything it had experienced before. The idea that an unseen killer, already responsible for multiple brutal attacks, had given the city an ultimatum: play jazz or die, shook every neighborhood, from the quiet suburbs to the crowded French Quarter. And then came the night of March 19, 1919. As the sun set, an eerie transformation overtook the city. Homes, bars, dance halls, and even small corner cafes filled with the sound of jazz. Families dragged phonographs into living rooms, setting records to spin it until the needles wore down. Others gathered musicians from nearby streets, hiring them to play through the night just to feel safe. Bands performed on balconies, in kitchens, on porches, and outside open windows. Some neighborhoods turned into impromptu festivals of sound, the air alive with trumpets and clarinets, drums pounding through the humid night air. Reporters described the scene as surreal, the entire city unified in fear, connected by the frantic rhythm of jazz music spilling into the streets. One local musician later recalled, "Every house, every bar, every place that had a gramophone had music pouring out of it. You could walk through the quarter and not take 2 steps without hearing horns." And the Axeman. That night, he didn't strike. Not a single home was attacked, no one was killed, and by sunrise, New Orleans was still alive. For many, it was a miracle, proof that the letter was real and the warning had been heeded. But for others, it was a game. The Axeman had toyed with an entire city, and he had won. In the weeks that followed, the streets buzzed with theories. Some believed the letter was genuine, a twisted challenge from a killer who thrived on attention. Others thought it was the work of an opportunist, someone trying to profit from chaos by boosting record sales and filling jazz clubs. But the attacks resumed soon after, ending any doubts that the threat was real. On August 10, 1919, the Axeman returned, striking the home of Steve and Sarah Boca. Steve survived with severe head injuries. Sarah, battered and bleeding, somehow stumbled into the street and screamed for help. Again, nothing was stolen, and the killer left behind his weapon, another axe taken from the victim's own home. Once more, he melted into the night without a trace. The randomness of the attacks became unbearable. Wealth, race, gender, and status meant nothing to him. Couples, single women, grocers, and laborers all fell under his blade. The only pattern was the lack of one. Detectives tried mapping the murders, searching for logic, but the city's narrow streets and twisting alleys only deepened the mystery. He could have lived anywhere. He could have been anyone. Some began to suspect he wasn't working alone. The precision of the attacks, the speed with which he entered and escaped undetected, suggested to a few investigators that the Axeman might have had an accomplice watching from the shadows. But like everything else in the case, the theory dissolved under scrutiny. By late 1919, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The Axeman vanished, leaving no name, no capture, and no closure for the terrified city. He had manipulated like an audience at a grand performance. Some claimed he left New Orleans and continued his murders elsewhere. Others believed he was arrested for an unrelated crime, and still others insisted he had died. But none of these explanations could be proven. What remained was the legend. The Axeman's letter, the jazz-filled night, and the sense that an entire city had once danced between life and death. In the space of a single humid evening became part of New Orleans' identity. Even today, in the glow of the French Quarter's neon lights, when saxophones cry beneath the weight of the night air, locals whisper about him, the phantom who demanded music instead of silence, death instead of indifference, and left a story no one would ever forget. And as the decades passed, the case lived on in books, documentaries, and songs. Musicians immortalized him, storytellers turned his letter into a warning, and historians debated his motives endlessly. Was he truly the supernatural figure he claimed to be in his letter, or just a manipulative killer who understood fear better than anyone? The truth lies somewhere in those humid streets, locked beneath the clamor of jazz and the memories of a city that learned to live with terror. By the summer of 1919, the people of New Orleans were living in a constant state of unease. After the infamous letter and the strange night when jazz filled every street, residents had hoped that the Axeman's reign of terror might be over. But in reality, that letter was not the conclusion, it was only a prelude. The attacks resumed, each one more vicious, unpredictable, and unnerving than the last, plunging the city deeper into paranoia. The Boca family attack in August 1919 had already reignited panic, but what followed would solidify the Axeman's legend forever. On the night of August 10th, Steve and Sarah Boca were sleeping when an intruder slipped into their home. Steve awoke to the blow of an axe and collapsed instantly, blood pouring across the sheets. Sarah screamed and ran for help, staggering into the street covered in wounds and panic, shouting into the humid darkness. Neighbors rushed to her side, terrified, but by the time they reached the house, the Axeman had vanished into the night, as though he had melted into the air itself. For the police, it was another puzzle with the same impossible pieces. The weapon? Another axe. The point of entry? A panel removed from a back door. The motive? None. Money and valuables were untouched, and the killer once again left his weapon behind. The randomness was maddening. He seemed to choose homes without reason, strike without hesitation, and disappear without leaving footprints, fingerprints, or even a stray fiber. Detectives, frustrated and exhausted, began working around the clock, combing through records and interrogating anyone who had even the faintest connection to the victims. But the more they searched, the less they understood. Then, in September 1919, the Axeman struck again, this time attacking a young grocer named Sam Ondalina in his own store. Sam barely survived, clinging to life long enough to describe a tall, shadowy figure moving with precision and speed, but his description was vague and inconsistent. Some investigators suspected Sam was too dazed to recall clearly, others feared he simply didn't want to say too much, terrified the Axeman might come back for him. By now, the fear had become suffocating. Families abandoned their homes and crowded into relatives' houses in safer neighborhoods. Businesses closed earlier than ever, streets emptied long before midnight, and the joyous music of the French Quarter grew quieter. Even jazz, the heartbeat of New Orleans, began to feel different. Clubs still played it, but now for many, it was less celebration and more protection, a ritual against the darkness that stalked the city. Inside the police department, frustration boiled over. Detectives fought bitterly over theories. Some were convinced the Axeman was a local, someone deeply familiar with the neighborhood's alleyways and patterns of the city. Others believed he was an outsider, someone who drifted into New Orleans for reasons unknown, and who would leave once he had his fill of violence. But as reports came in of similar killings in nearby towns, attacks involving axes, nighttime intrusions, and eerily familiar wounds, the idea that he might be a traveler became harder to ignore. Despite this, no one could explain the letter, the boastful, theatrical declaration that demanded jazz to spare lives. If the Axeman was only passing through, why toy with New Orleans so specifically? Some began to suspect there were two killers, one responsible for the early murders, another inspired by the hysteria, using the letter as a stage for their own crimes. But with no evidence, it remained only speculation. The attacks continued into October, when another family was assaulted while sleeping. Again, the same haunting details: entry through a back panel, a weapon from the victim's own home, no robbery, no witnesses. The randomness stripped away any sense of safety. Wealth, age, race, none of it mattered. He could strike anywhere, anyone, at any time. In the absence of answers, legends began to grow. People whispered about the Axeman's supernatural qualities, his ability to vanish, to know which houses were most vulnerable, to move undetected across entire neighborhoods. Some called him a demon, especially after his own letter claimed he was a spirit from hell. Others theorized he was a musician himself, obsessed with jazz and using his killings to force the city into his personal symphony of fear. As the year drew to a close, the killings suddenly stopped, just as they had in 1918, without explanation, without reason. Weeks passed, then months. New Orleans waited in silence, holding its breath, expecting another attack that never came. Eventually, slowly, life crept back into the streets. Music filled the air once again, and the French Quarter returned to its endless rhythm. But the questions never left. Who was the Axeman? Why did he demand music in exchange for life? Why did he choose some families and leave others untouched? And most haunting of all, where did he go? Over the decades, suspects came and went. One man, Joseph Momfer, was even killed in 1920 by the widow of one of the Axeman's victims, who claimed she was taking revenge on her husband's killer. Newspapers speculated wildly that Momfer's death marked the end of the Axeman's reign, but police never confirmed any connection, and his name eventually faded into uncertainty. Other suspects were questioned over the years, but none were ever charged. Today, the Axeman remains a phantom, his identity as shadowy and elusive as the humid nights of New Orleans in 1919. Historians and true crime researchers still pore over old police reports, faded photographs, and grainy newspaper clippings, trying to piece together a story that never truly ended. And in the city itself, his legend lingers. Bars still tell his tale, ghost tours wander the streets where he once walked, and musicians still remember the night the entire city played jazz to survive. Even now, more than a century later, the sound of a lone saxophone in a quiet alley after midnight can stir an unease deep in the bones, the memory of a night when the city was forced to choose between silence and survival. The Axeman had demanded music, and New Orleans gave him a symphony. And when he disappeared, he left behind more than unanswered questions. He left behind a story that has never stopped echoing. By the beginning of 1920, the city of New Orleans had grown tired of holding its breath. Months had passed since the last confirmed attack of the Axeman, and the streets had slowly returned to life. But the fear never truly left. Behind locked doors and shuttered windows, families whispered about him, the shadow with the axe, the phantom who had turned their lives into a waking nightmare. People avoided walking alone at night, children were ushered home before sunset, and even the most crowded jazz clubs carried an undercurrent of unease. Then came the whispers of another killing. In early 1920, several blocks away from the French Quarter, a young couple was found attacked in their home. Their wounds bore eerie similarities to the Axeman's earlier victims, bludgeoning with a blunt object, deep cuts, and, once again, no robbery. The police, however, hesitated to connect the case to the Axeman. Officials feared that acknowledging a possible return would throw the city back into chaos, and so they downplayed the reports. But among locals, the conclusion was obvious. He was back. Yet, just as quickly as the rumors spread, they stopped. The case led nowhere. No witnesses, no suspects, no confession. And then, just as before, the killing ceased. Some detectives quietly speculated that the Axeman had left New Orleans entirely, perhaps fleeing the growing police pressure or seeking new hunting grounds where his name meant nothing. That theory gained traction when similar crimes began surfacing in nearby towns, attacks committed with axes, homes broken into in the dead of night, couples assaulted as they slept. But without proper coordination between police departments in 1920, these connections remained whispers rather than confirmed evidence. The most persistent theory revolved around a man named Joseph Momfer. In December 1920, Momfer was shot and killed in Los Angeles by a woman named Esther Albano, the widow of one of the Axeman's earlier victims. She claimed she had tracked him across the country and killed him in revenge, believing he had murdered her husband during the Axeman spree. Newspapers seized the story, declaring the case solved, the phantom unmasked, and New Orleans free at last. But the truth wasn't so simple. Police files from the time make no direct connection between Montfort and the Axeman. His criminal record existed. He was involved in organized crime, extortion, and smuggling, but nothing linked him definitively to the murders. To some, this explanation was too convenient, a way to close the book on a mystery that had terrified the city for years. For many investigators, the Axeman remained at large, an enigma who had simply melted into history. Others, however, believed the attacks were never the work of a single killer at all. Some criminologists studying the case decades later suggested the possibility of multiple attackers, individuals or small groups who used similar methods but acted independently. The chaos of the time, the limited resources of the police, and the slow communication between precincts created the perfect environment for a series of unrelated murders to be tied together under a single frightening name, the Axeman. But this theory, too, was impossible to prove. One of the strangest mysteries surrounding the case was the letter itself. Historians have debated for decades whether the Axeman truly wrote it. The tone was theatrical, mocking, almost playful, and the promise to spare Holmes playing jazz led some to believe it was an elaborate hoax. Yet the letter came at a time when the attacks were escalating, and the Axeman's absence on the night of the jazz ultimatum only deepened its credibility. If it was a hoax, it was a spectacularly lucky one. If it was real, then the killer wasn't just a murderer, he was a manipulator. Someone who understood fear well enough to make an entire city dance for him. By the mid-1920s, the legend had firmly taken root. Stories of the Axeman became part of New Orleans folklore, told over drinks in smoky bars, and whispered on dimly lit street corners. Musicians wrote songs inspired by the jazz ultimatum, and ghost tours decades later would take visitors past homes where the murders had taken place, each creaking door and cracked shutter adding to the mythology. The man who had terrified thousands became a symbol of something larger, a city haunted by its own shadows. And yet, the most haunting part of the Axeman's story isn't just that he was never caught, it's that he vanished so suddenly. No gradual fading, no escalation leading to a conclusion, just silence. The attacks stopped, and New Orleans was left with nothing but unanswered questions. Was the Axeman a local who slipped back into the crowd, his name forgotten even as his story lived on? Was he a traveler, a man whose hunger for violence drove him from city to city, leaving trails of blood scattered across the South? Or was he caught quietly for some unrelated crime, his identity locked away in prison records that no one ever thought to connect? More than a century later, the answers remain buried. The surviving records, faded police reports, fragile witness statements, and grainy photographs are incomplete, leaving behind a puzzle missing to many pieces. And yet, one fact remains clear. The Axeman understood New Orleans better than anyone. He knew its streets, its rhythms, its fears. He knew that music was the city's soul, and on that one unforgettable night in March 1919, he forced New Orleans to play for him. Today, walking through the French Quarter on a humid summer evening, the story lingers in the air. You can still hear the echoes of jazz spilling from open doorways, still see the glow of flickering gas lamps reflecting off old brick walls. And if you listen closely, in the quiet spaces between the music, you can almost hear the faintest whisper of a shadow that once walked these streets, an unseen figure moving silently beneath the weight of history, leaving only fear and mystery behind. The Axeman may have disappeared, but his legend remains eternal. By the late 1920s, more than a decade after the terror of the Axeman of New Orleans, the city had changed, but the unease had not fully left. People went back to dancing in jazz clubs, couples strolled through the French Quarter, and streetcars rattled down Canal Street just as they always had. Yet beneath the music and laughter, the unanswered questions still haunted New Orleans. Who was the Axeman? Why had he stopped? And, perhaps most chilling of all, was he truly gone? The police investigation had long since grown cold, but detectives and amateur sleuths alike kept returning to the case. Some were obsessed, poring over yellowed case files and faded photographs, believing they could find the clue others had missed. Over the years, several suspects emerged, each seeming plausible in some ways, but every theory came with contradictions that kept the truth just out of reach. One of the most infamous suspects was Joseph Momfer, the man killed in Los Angeles in 1920 by Esther Albano, the widow of one of the Axeman's earliest victims. Newspapers at the time painted Momfer's death as the end of the story, the conclusion the city needed. The killer had been punished, justice served. But police files tell a more complicated story. Momfer was a known criminal with ties to organized crime, gambling, and extortion rings in New Orleans, but there was little actual evidence connecting him to the Axeman's attacks. Witnesses could not place him near any of the crime scenes, and his known methods of intimidation didn't match the brutality of the murders. Some historians today believe the city, desperate for closure, simply accepted the story because it was easier than admitting the truth that the real Axeman was still out there. Another line of investigation focused on local grocers. Many of the Axeman's victims were Italian-American store owners, leading police at the time to speculate that the killings were connected to tensions within immigrant communities or possible extortion. Rackets. This theory gained momentum because several surviving victims claimed to have received strange letters or warnings prior to the attacks, cryptic notes implying that they owed money or were marked. Could the Axeman have been a hired killer, someone working for a criminal organization and forcing silent debts through blood? The problem with this theory, however, was that not all of the victims fit the profile. Some families had no apparent connection to these disputes, and the randomness of the attacks contradicted the idea of a targeted campaign. There were also whispers among investigators about the possibility that the Axeman was someone inside the community, hiding in plain sight. Several surviving victims described glimpses of a tall man dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured, but other reports conflicted wildly on his appearance. Some believed he was white, others claimed he had darker skin, and a few even suggested he was a skilled burglar with an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. Then came the most controversial theory of all, that there wasn't one Axeman, but several. Some criminologists reviewing the case decades later noticed small inconsistencies across the crime scenes. While the general method was the same, forced entry, blunt force trauma, and the use of the victim's own axes, there were subtle differences in the level of violence, the angles of the blows, and even the way doors were removed. These experts argued that the Axeman may have been a collective myth, born from a string of unrelated but similar killings. But this theory clashes with the most unnerving detail of the entire case, the letter. Its theatrical tone, the chilling promise to spare lovers of jazz, and the Axeman's apparent knowledge of the police investigation suggest a single calculating mind. By the mid-20th century, the Axeman had evolved from a killer into a legend. Ghost stories emerged around his figure, tales of a shadow that slipped between the gas lamps and rooftops of the French Quarter, watching quietly from alleyways. Tour guides spun his story into the cultural fabric of New Orleans, and musicians immortalized him in jazz songs, especially after the Night of Salvation, when the entire city played music to avoid his blade. Yet among the folklore, the facts of the case remained disturbingly unresolved. In the 1990s, cold case researchers revisited the Axeman files, applying modern forensic techniques to what little evidence remained. Unfortunately, the technology of the time couldn't save samples that had degraded over nearly a century. No viable DNA, no preserved fingerprints, and almost no physical evidence survived. Without new breakthroughs, Investigators were forced to rely on old interviews, many of which were inconsistent or lost entirely. And still, there are those today who believe the Axeman's identity is buried somewhere in forgotten archives, a misfiled police report, an overlooked witness statement, or a name that appeared in the investigation but was dismissed too quickly. Others believe the truth is darker, that the Axeman was never caught because he was protected, perhaps by power, wealth, or influence, and that his crimes were allowed to fade into silence intentionally. For the people of New Orleans, though, the facts hardly matter anymore. The legend has outgrown the case, shaping itself into something far larger than the man behind the murders. On humid nights when the city's streets grow quiet, when music spills softly from dimly lit bars, locals still joke, half seriously, about playing jazz to keep the Axeman away. The sound of trumpets, clarinets, and drums has become part of the city's defense, a ritual against the possibility that one night the shadow could return. More than 100 years later, the story endures because of what it represents: fear, mystery, and the fragile line between safety and chaos. Whether he was one man, several, or none of the suspects ever named, the Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The city survived his reign, but the echoes of those nights, the sound of jazz played to stave off death, still drift through its streets like a ghost. More than a century has passed since the Axeman of New Orleans brought the city to its knees, yet the case continues to haunt investigators, historians, and true crime researchers alike. While the terror of those humid nights in 1918 and 1919 has long faded, the mystery remains unsolved, lingering like the echo of a trumpet in an empty street. And in recent decades, as forensic science has advanced and archives have been re-examined, new theories have emerged, some grounded in evidence, others more speculative, each adding layers to a legend that refuses to die. In the 2000s, researchers began poring over every surviving police report, autopsy note, and newspaper clipping related to the Axeman attacks. Technology promised breakthroughs the original investigators could never have imagined. Forensic teams attempted to recover DNA from the few pieces of physical evidence that had been preserved, fragments of clothing, axe handles, and wood from broken doors. But after more than 100 years, time had taken its toll. Most samples had degraded beyond recognition, leaving nothing usable for modern testing. Even so, the effort wasn't wasted. It revealed gaps in the original investigation that helped clarify why the killer was never caught. One of the biggest revelations from these reviews was the lack of coordination among precincts at the time. In 1919, New Orleans was a patchwork of jurisdictions, and police departments rarely shared information effectively. Many attacks in nearby neighborhoods, even in adjacent parishes, may have been connected but were never officially tied to the Axeman spree. Investigators today believe the killer may have had more victims than originally recorded, possibly extending his reach beyond New Orleans into smaller Louisiana towns and even neighboring Mississippi. Modern criminal profilers have also revisited the case, applying contemporary psychological frameworks to the Axeman's behavior. What they found was chilling. The killer appeared to thrive on chaos and control. He didn't just kill, he manipulated an entire city, bending it to his will with the infamous letter that demanded jazz. Profilers describe this as a rare form of psychological dominance, where fear becomes part of the killer's strategy. By forcing an entire city to play music under threat of death, the Axeman elevated his crimes into a kind of performance, one where he dictated the rhythm, and New Orleans danced to his tune. Yet the letter itself continues to divide experts. Some linguists studying its phrasing suggest that it was not written by the killer at all, but rather by someone seeking attention, perhaps a jazz promoter or a newspaper editor capitalizing on public hysteria. Others reject this, pointing out that the night of March 19, 1919, when Jez filled every home and street, saw no attacks anywhere in the city. To them, this wasn't coincidence. It was proof that the letter came from the Axeman himself, and that his promise to spare lovers of jazz was genuine. There's also renewed focus on Joseph Mumford, long rumored to be the Axeman, and killed in 1920 by a widow seeking revenge. For decades, his name has been synonymous with the case, but deeper dives into historical records raise new doubts. While Mumford was indeed a criminal with ties to organized rackets and violent disputes in the city, there is still no conclusive evidence connecting him to the murders. Some researchers believe his death was simply convenient for the police, providing them with a way to close the case without proof, allowing the city to move forward without reopening its wounds. In contrast, another set of theories centers on the Italian-American community and the possibility that the Axeman's killings were linked to organized extortion rackets. The fact that many victims were Italian grocers fueled speculation that the attacks were punishments for resisting demands from local criminal groups. However, this theory also fails to explain the killer's bizarre theatricality, particularly the letter and his fascination with jazz, as well as why several non-Italian families with no ties to the disputes were attacked in the same brutal fashion. The idea of multiple killers remains one of the most debated aspects of the case among modern criminologists. When comparing autopsy reports, subtle differences emerge. The depth and angles of blows, the positioning of bodies, and even the types of tools used varied slightly between incidents. While these variations could reflect evolving techniques of a single killer, some experts argue they hint at copycats, individuals emboldened by the Axeman's legend, attacking under his shadow. But the lack of direct evidence makes this impossible to confirm. Despite the frustrations, the enduring obsession with the Axeman has led to an unusual kind of progress: the preservation and digitization of archival material. Universities, private researchers, and local historians have meticulously scanned fragile reports, photographs, and newspaper articles, making them available for modern analysis. Some believe this renewed access could allow future breakthroughs using technologies that don't yet exist: deep forensic imaging, advanced linguistic analysis, or even AI-assisted suspect profiling based on historical data. Today, walking through the French Quarter, it's easy to see why the Axeman's legend persists. The same narrow streets, wrought iron balconies, and flickering lamps remain, creating an atmosphere where the past feels just within reach. Bars still play jazz deep into the night, and ghost tours lead visitors down alleys where, more than a century ago, shadows slipped between doorways, carrying fear in their silence. Locals tell the story as though it happened yesterday, their voices hushed but knowing, as if the Axeman's spirit still lingers in the humid night air. In the end, the mystery survives because of what it represents. The Axeman of New Orleans wasn't just a killer, he was an enigma who turned fear into ritual, whose crimes blurred the line between reality and folklore. His identity remains locked away, hidden beneath a century of lost evidence and unanswered questions. But every time the city hums with jazz, there's a sense, subtle, persistent, impossible to shake, that somewhere, deep in its history, the Axeman is still listening. Even now, the case remains technically open. Investigators, historians, and enthusiasts continue to revisit it, hoping that one overlooked clue, one forgotten statement, or one fragment of preserved DNA might finally solve the riddle. But until that day comes, New Orleans carries the story like an old song, haunting, familiar, and unfinished. By the early 21st century, the story of the Axeman of New Orleans had transformed from a terrifying memory into a cultural legend. Yet the mystery surrounding his identity remained as unsolved as ever. More than 100 years had passed, but researchers, historians, and cold case specialists continued to sift through the fragments left behind: yellowed police reports, brittle witness statements, grainy photographs, and fading autopsy records. The deeper they dug, the more intricate the web of theories became, revealing that the Axeman wasn't just a killer, he was a riddle that blurred the line between fact and folklore. Forensic experts today point to the Axeman-esque patterns as one of the greatest paradoxes in the case. On one hand, his attacks displayed careful planning, entering homes silently, removing panels from doors without waking the occupants, and using the victim's own axes rather than bringing his own weapon. On the other hand, the randomness of his targets defied all logic. Some victims were wealthy, others poor, some were Italian grocers. Others had no ties to the immigrant community at all. In modern criminal profiling, such lack of a victim type suggests compulsion over motive, a killer driven less by revenge or financial gain than by the act itself. But if the Axeman killed purely for the thrill, why did he stop? This question has divided modern researchers into three main camps. The first group believes the Joseph Mumford theory still holds weight. According to this view, Mumford, a known criminal tied to local extortion rackets, matched many circumstantial details. After the attacks ceased in 1919, he was tracked to Los Angeles, where in 1920 he was shot dead by Esther Albano, the widow of one of the Axeman's suspected victims. She confessed that she killed him believing he was responsible for her husband's murder. While this theory ties up the narrative neatly, modern scholars remain skeptical. No solid forensic link ever tied Mumford to the murders, and his criminal activity, while violent, rarely involved the kind of sadistic feature seen in the Axeman's spree. Many believe his death simply gave the police and the city a convenient scapegoat, a way to close the book without real answers. The second theory focuses on the possibility of organized crime. Many of the Axeman's victims were Italian-American grocers, leading some researchers to suggest that the killings were tied to mafia-related extortion schemes. In this theory, the Axeman acted as an enforcer, punishing families who refused to pay protection money. At first glance, this explanation appears plausible. Extortion and intimidation were rampant in New Orleans during the early 20th century. But this theory falters when examined against the details of the attacks. Several victims had no ties to grocery businesses or organized crime, and the brutality of the murders seemed far beyond what would typically be used to send a message. Even within mafia circles, such public and unpredictable violence would have been bad for business. The third, and perhaps most disturbing theory, is that there was never just one Axeman. Some criminologists studying the case today note subtle variations in the killings, differences in the depth and angle of the blows, inconsistencies in methods of entry, and even the number of strikes delivered. While the basic pattern, nighttime attacks with axes taken from victims' homes, was consistent, these small deviations suggest the possibility of copycats or multiple killers operating during the same period. If true, the letter, the music ultimatum, and the terror that followed could have amplified these killings into something larger than any single person, a phenomenon feeding on hysteria. But like all other theories, this one remains speculation without hard evidence. Perhaps the most enduring mystery of all revolves around the letter. Was it authentic, or was it a hoax? Modern linguistic analysis has revealed peculiarities in its phrasing shifts between formal English and theatrical dramatics, suggesting that the author may have been highly educated, or deliberately imitating someone else's voice. If the Axeman himself wrote it, the implications are chilling. He didn't just crave killing, he craved control. He manipulated an entire city, forcing thousands of people into a shared ritual, playing jazz all night to escape his blade. Yet skeptics argue that the letter could have been penned by someone else entirely. Perhaps a jazz club promoter, a newspaper editor seeking headlines, or even an opportunistic prankster. Advances in forensic genealogy have renewed hope of finally solving the case. In recent years, cold case specialists have begun revisiting preserved fragments, clothing fibers, wood splinters from broken doors, and axe handles collected at crime scenes. While many samples are too degraded for traditional testing, newer methods capable of extracting partial genetic profiles from trace materials have opened new doors. If even one usable DNA match is recovered, it could be cross-referenced with public genealogy databases, potentially identifying descendants of the killer or uncovering hidden family links. Though no breakthrough has been announced yet, researchers remain cautiously optimistic. Meanwhile, historians continue to uncover overlooked connections in the archives. Some believe that similar axe-related attacks in nearby Lafayette, Baton Rouge, and Gulfport between 1911 and 1921 may be tied to the same individual. Others argue that the Axeman's abrupt disappearance from New Orleans coincides suspiciously with an unsolved series of murders in Texas and Alabama, suggesting he may have simply moved on. If true, the Axeman's story may stretch far beyond what the city of New Orleans has long believed. Yet even with all the data, theories, and technology, the truth remains elusive. The Axeman of New Orleans has become more than a killer. He is a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder of how fragile control can be when fear spreads unchecked. The jazz-filled night of March 19, 1919, when an entire city played music to save itself, stands as one of the most surreal moments in American true crime history. A martyr wrote a letter, and New Orleans obeyed. And when the killing stopped, he left behind a silence that has lasted for more than a century. Today, if you walk through the French Quarter on a damp, foggy night, the atmosphere feels unchanged from 100 years ago. Gas lamps flicker against wrought-iron balconies, saxophones cry softly from dimly lit bars, and the humid air carries the echoes of old stories. Tour guides still recount the night the entire city danced to stay alive, and locals joke, only half seriously, that as long as the jazz keeps playing, the Axeman will stay away. But legends like his don't simply fade. They linger, whispered from generation to generation, taking on new shapes and new meanings. Perhaps one day, a forgotten clue hidden in a police archive or a breakthrough in forensic technology will finally put a name to the shadow that stalked New Orleans. Until then, the Axeman lives on in the music, the fear, and the endless unanswered questions left behind in the humid Louisiana night. The story of the Axeman of New Orleans does not end with an arrest, a trial, or a confession. It ends with silence, the kind of silence that lingers long after the music stops. More than a century later, the streets where his shadow once slipped beneath flickering gas lamps remain the same. The wrought-iron balconies still catch the soft glow of streetlights, jazz still drifts through humid nights, and yet, somewhere deep in the air, his story remains suspended, unfinished, unresolved, and told in its entirety. After the killings stopped in 1919, the city exhaled, but not in relief. It was a quiet, cautious breath, like stepping out into a fog and hoping the storm had truly passed. Families returned to their lives, doors were unbolted, and the sound of jazz once again spilled into the streets of the French Quarter. But behind every late-night melody, there was still the memory of the night when New Orleans played not for celebration, but for survival, the night when an entire city danced to the beat of its own fear. Over the decades, the Axeman became less a man and more a phantom. His story grew into something larger than the murders themselves, a legend woven into the fabric of New Orleans. There are bars where his name is spoken in low voices, ghost tours that wind down narrow alleys to homes where his victims once lived, and jazz clubs where musicians still tell his tale between sets. The city has made him a part of its identity, not out of reverence, but because forgetting him entirely would mean erasing a chapter of what made New Orleans the strange, resilient, beautiful place it is. What haunts most, even now, isn't the blood or the brutality. It's the letter. That single page of words, written in a hand so confident, so theatrical, so disturbingly calm, turned the Axeman from a murder into something else entirely. The way he spoke of himself, a spirit from the hottest hell, beyond capture, beyond human, was unlike anything the city had seen before. And then there was his demand, music in exchange for mercy. It is almost impossible to comprehend the sight New Orleans must have been that night in March 1919, every home, every club, every alley alive with the frantic hum of jazz. The air so heavy with sound that silence itself felt dangerous. That was his power. He didn't just kill, he made the city move to his rhythm. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. No goodbyes, no farewell letter, no grand finale. Only unanswered questions left behind, drifting like echoes through the French Quarter. Even now, researchers pore over his story. Historians trace fragile police reports, criminologists profile behaviors, and forensic teams test preserved fragments of evidence, hoping that modern science can do what 1919 could not. They chase his shadow through brittle pages and fading headlines, but every time the trail ends the same way: silence. A name lost to time. A phantom who walked away. And perhaps that is why the legend endures. The Axeman is everything we fear in the dark: unpredictability, anonymity, and control. He struck without pattern, chose without reason, and disappeared without warning. You could lock your doors, bolt your windows, guard your family, and it still wouldn't matter because he chose when to come, and more importantly, when to leave. He held a city hostage, not with his axe, but with uncertainty. Sometimes, late at night, locals still talk about him. The way their grandparents or great-grandparents whispered his story in kitchens lit by single lamps. They'll point to the quiet corners of the city, to faded wooden shutters and old brick homes, and they'll tell you that the streets remember. Not in the way history remembers kings or battles, but the way the air remembers fear. They'll tell you about the strange sensation that creeps in when you walk alone through the French Quarter after midnight, when the music fades, and you feel the shadows stretching just a little too long. And maybe that's the truth. The Axeman never really left. Not his name, not his story, not the unease he planted in the heart of New Orleans. He lives on in the spaces between the notes, in the silence after the last trumpet fades, in the quiet that feels heavier than sound. The case remains officially open, but everyone knows that doesn't matter anymore. Time has swallowed the evidence. Witnesses are gone, suspects buried, statements forgotten. Maybe someday a fragment of DNA or a long-lost diary will bring closure, but even if it does, the mystery will stay. Because this was never just a story about a killer. It's about a city, a night, and the strange, fragile thread that ties fear to survival. Tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine the humid weight of a New Orleans evening in 1919. Imagine the distant echo of a saxophone from a nearby balcony, the warm glow of a gas lamp swaying in the breeze, and the whisper of footsteps in the alley behind you. Imagine doors bolted, phonographs spinning, and the frantic harmony of a city playing for its life. And then imagine that moment when the music stopped, when the city waited, holding its breath, wondering if the silence meant safety or death. That was the Axeman's gift to New Orleans, not terror, but memory. A reminder that even in a city built on rhythm and celebration, shadows still walk when the music fades. And perhaps, somewhere deep within the soft hum of the quarter, if you listen closely, you might still hear him. Not his axe, not his steps, but his silence. The silence of a story without an ending.